Shots fired in the courtroom. I can still recall that morning etched in the memories of everyone who witnessed it, a day that would forever change the way America thought about grief, justice, and consequences. The beige-walled courtroom in suburban New Jersey was supposed to be a solemn stage for due process, not a battleground for a mother's despair. Reporters buzzed quietly in the back. The judge adjusted his spectacles. Lawyers shuffled papers, awaiting the next round of questioning. Few anticipated the tragic, electric charge about to rip through those four walls. Linda Lawrence, once just an ordinary single mom standing at the edge of her own heartache, was seated at the front, her knuckles white from clutching a battered photograph of her late daughter, Emily. For months, she had sat through a trial that felt both excruciatingly slow and violently fast, blurred by trauma, sharpened by rage. Across the aisle, just a handful of yards away, sat Frank Dalton, the man accused of the unimaginable. No words were spoken. There were only the heavy, suffocating silences between testimony, the smell of stale coffee, the endless jotting of pens. Frank had just taken the stand, his voice flat, his gaze fixed on the defense table. That was the moment when Linda's world narrowed to a single point, the glint of a handgun hidden in her purse, the irresistible gravity of pain and fury. Without warning, Linda stood, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. She crossed past the witnesses, her steps quick but trembling with years of sorrow and powerlessness. Time seemed to hang suspended. She reached into her purse and suddenly, the cold steel was in her shaking hands. It was a revolver, registered years before for self-defense, now an instrument of irreversible consequence. She didn't shout, didn't warn, didn't hesitate. The tension in the courtroom snapped as 8 deafening shots rang out, each one punctuating years of unanswered pleas, relentless nights, and systemic failures that left a mother with nothing but the raw urge to act. The gunpowder's acrid scent filled the air as people ducked under benches. The judge yelled for order that could never be restored. The bailiffs lunged, but too late. 8 bullets found their mark, sending chaos and shockwaves through the court. Linda dropped the weapon, her shoulders crumpling. "For my Emily," she whispered, her voice trembling as the officers moved in. Reporters scrambled to document the impossible, photographs, frantic phone calls, and the stunned silence of those who realized they would be discussing this moment for decades to come. What happened that day was not simply an act of violence. It was an explosion of every failure and fracture in the system that had let Emily down. It set off a firestorm of debate across America. Was this justice? Was it murder? Or was it the desperate, intractable love of a mother pushed beyond her breaking point? That courtroom, intended to be the arena of American justice, had become witness to a whole new tragedy, one that would ripple out far beyond New Jersey, touching hearts, headlines, and legal history for years to come. Maternal love, in the face of tragedy. From the outside, Linda Lawrence might have seemed like any other single mother struggling to keep herself and her daughter afloat in a quiet apartment complex just outside Philadelphia. Yet behind the closed door of apartment 3B, the love she bore for Emily was something fierce and fierce again, uncomplicated in its purity, yet complicated by the unforgiving world pressing down from all sides. Linda's life, in many ways, was a lesson in resilience and sacrifice, punctuated by the kind of joy and longing familiar to so many parents living paycheck to paycheck in America. When Emily was born, Linda felt an instant surge of purpose that had nothing to do with her own dreams or disappointments. Every sleepless night as a baby, every scraped knee, every birthday cake with too little frosting and mismatched candles, these moments forged a bond of trust between mother and daughter that felt unbreakable. Linda swore to herself in those earliest days, nestled in a thrift store rocking chair, that nothing and no one would ever hurt her child. She would spare Emily from the world's sharp edges, even if it meant holding back her own ambitions or drowning out her own needs. But life continually tested the boundaries of that promise. Linda juggled 2 jobs, sometimes 3, waiting tables or mopping hospital floors late at night, always returning to Emily's side before dawn. She learned to measure love in bagged lunches, bedtime stories, and the small, unspoken comforts she tried so hard to provide. Even the moments of exhaustion, when the weight of the world seemed poised to crush her, could be chased away by the sound of Emily's laughter, candle-tiny but warm. Yet with every step forward, hardship crept in. The neighborhood wasn't always safe, bills arrived faster than paychecks, the hope for a brighter future sometimes flickered out. Linda's own parents, distant emotionally and geographically, offered little in the way of support. What she lacked in resources she made up for with stubborn grit, and to Emily, her mother was both fortress and home. When the unimaginable struck and Emily disappeared, the shattering of Linda's world was absolute. At first, she clung to hope with all the ferocity of an animal mother defending her young. She papered telephone poles with missing child flyers. She haunted police stations and begged neighbors, wearing her raw fear like a second skin. As the days turned into weeks and hope decayed into grief, Linda found herself locked in a private battle against helplessness, fury, and the primal ache of a bond severed by violence. In the eyes of society, Linda might have been written off as just another statistic, a mother failed by the system, a casualty of her circumstances. But inside, the love she held for Emily became a crucible, transforming her pain into something hot and undeniable, something that would soon boil over into the public eye. Her longing to protect her daughter did not die with Emily. Instead, it combusted into an unstoppable drive to seek justice, no matter the cost. Those sleepless nights spent whispering apologies to the photo on her nightstand, the growing chasm between her and the world, and the echo of a tiny voice forever silenced. These would shape Linda in ways she could never have imagined. Love, in the end, was what propelled her to the brink, a mother devoured by devotion, caught between her faith in justice and the animal logic of heartbreak. In tragedy's wake, maternal love became both her salvation and her undoing. In the beginning, nothing but happiness. Before the crushing weight of tragedy, there existed an era in Linda's life that glimmered with humble contentment. Fresh out of high school, she rented her first apartment, a sunlit studio with peeling paint, the kind where you could hear neighbors laugh on summer evenings through the thin walls. Linda was young, but beneath her soft smile lay a resolve as sturdy as the city that raised her. Her early years as a single woman in Philadelphia were stitched together by simple dreams, steady work, a safe place to sleep, and that old, persistent hope for love. She found joy in the overlooked, cheap vinyl records spinning in her living room, the comfort of takeout Chinese on the weekends, easy conversations with friends as midnight drifted in. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and that honesty felt like luxury after a childhood spent in instability. That happiness deepened when she learned she was pregnant. The news hit her with a wild blend of fear and hope. Linda's family history, marked by distant parents and too many goodbyes, made her determined to give her child the foundation she never had. She threw herself into reordering her life. There were evening classes at the community college, and long shifts waiting tables at a local diner. She saved every dollar, dreamt of cribs and stuffed animals, and painted the nursery in gentle yellows and blues. Linda began doting over baby books and prenatal vitamins, her whole world organizing itself around the heartbeat growing inside her. After Emily arrived, happiness in their tiny apartment took on its truest shape. There were Sunday mornings tangled in bedsheets, the soft, milky scent of a newborn and soft sunlight cutting patterns on the hardwood floor. Linda found that the exhaustion of motherhood paled in comparison to the tender privilege of loving Emily. Their world was small but sturdy, bound together by lullabies, laughter, and the kind of hope that can withstand anything. At least, that's how it seemed. Back then, Linda believed she was building a sanctuary, just her and her daughter, against the world. Those years shimmered in memory, protected from the storms yet to come. Nothing was perfect, but every imperfection was filled in, somehow, with the gold dust of new beginnings. Linda's greatest happiness was not measured by the size of her home or the weight of her wallet, but by the simple, everyday fact of being someone's mother. In those early days, the future was unmarked. There was only the present, bright, fragile, and impossibly full of promise. Born into hardship. From the very beginning, hardship was the backdrop to Emily's existence. Linda, scarcely more than a young woman herself, was flooded with anxiety the day she discovered she was pregnant. 1,000 worries nested in her mind. How would she provide a secure home, a stable future, and all the small dignities a child deserved on little more than minimum wage? In America, the land of opportunity often had its doors half closed to young single mothers, especially those without family support. Linda remembered the day Emily first came home from the hospital. The apartment was so modest, its cupboards lacking and mattress on the ground, but she poured her heart into making every corner welcoming. She would hum old songs while gently rocking the baby to sleep, promising herself that no matter what, Emily would never feel unloved or unwanted. Even during the cold New Jersey winters, when the heating barely worked and icy drafts crept beneath the door, Linda found warmth in the weight of her daughter pressed against her chest. Life for the two of them was a daily negotiation with necessity. Linda hustled for shifts at local diners, picking up double hours when she could, always balancing exhaustion with the knowledge that diapers, rent, and groceries didn't wait for payday. Sometimes there wasn't enough to go around, no babysitter could be afforded, so little Emily was swaddled and bundled off with Linda for late-night shifts, tucked safely in a corner of the break room, or gently sung to sleep by the clatter of kitchen pans. Neighbors would sometimes cast judgmental glances, as if Linda's determination to keep her baby close was a sign of irresponsibility, not devotion. But she steeled herself against these sideways looks. To her, taking Emily along everywhere was as much about survival as it was about love. There was an odd kind of pride that filled Linda at the end of each week, not the pride of financial success but the certainty that against all odds, her daughter was safe, warm, and above all, cherished. No one saw the quiet strength it took for Linda to put food on the table, to push past days so draining she could barely stand, to counter every fear with a plan and every disappointment with the fierce promise that she would not fail. Emily was born into adversity, but every bedtime lullaby and peanut butter sandwich Linda scraped together was a protest, a statement that hardship would not define who her daughter could become. And so, in a world that sometimes seemed pitiless, Emily grew up loved beyond measure, a bright spot that gave Linda purpose, resilience, and a reason to keep hoping, even when hope felt in short supply. The bar, a place not fit for a child. If there was one place in America that constantly made Linda's heart drop with worry, it was the neighborhood bar where she worked nearly every night. The neon glare of red and blue lights spilled onto the cracked sidewalk, and inside, layers of cigarette smoke swirled above weathered pool tables and the drone of country ballads. This bar was Linda's main source of income, the reason Emily had food on the table and a roof overhead. But it was also a constant source of anxiety, for a bar was no place for a child, especially not in a city like Philadelphia, where troubles like drunks never really left at closing time. Emily, bright-eyed and trusting, became a sort of unofficial mascot at the bar over the months her mother worked there. She colored on napkins behind the counter, peeked out at regulars with shy curiosity, and quickly endeared herself to most of the staff, grizzled older bartenders who tried to keep their language clean when she was nearby, and waitresses who would sneak her maraschino cherries with a wink. Yet beneath the surface of these tender moments, Linda always felt like she was balancing on the edge of a knife. The hustle and noise, the unpredictable mood swings of customers after one too many drinks, and the constant river of strangers, these were dangers she could never fully block out. On paper, Linda knew she was taking a risk. Laws in most states forbade children in bars after certain hours, yet desperation often left her with no other choice. Babysitters were expensive, family was out of reach, and every extra hour on her shift meant bills got paid. Still, she kept a close eye on Emily, never letting her stray out of sight, even if that meant sending her to nap in the supply closet with a pile of bar towels as her makeshift bed. She told herself that she'd only do this until she could afford something better. But the months stretched on. At times, Linda could see the toll the environment took on Emily, the way she startled at loud laughter, how her gaze darted anxiously when an argument broke out, or the sadness in her eyes when other children on the street would ask why she never came outside to play in the evenings. There was also the unpredictable coming and going of characters Linda didn't trust. She would scan faces, keeping a mental list of who was safe and who wasn't. One regular named Mick always gave her a chill. Slick hair, too wide smile, a habit of asking Emily questions that seemed innocent but set off alarm bells in Linda's weary mind. The prospect of ever letting down her guard, of ever putting Emily at risk was unthinkable. And yet, this strange nocturnal routine created a world where mother and daughter became each other's shield. Linda developed the instincts of a hawk, her every sense fine-tuned to her child's presence, or absence, amid the nightly chaos. She counted the days until they might have a different life, but every dawn was a recalculated risk. People around her judged. Some customers whispered about irresponsibility. A few kind-hearted souls offered to watch Emily, but Linda never quite trusted anyone enough. The shame and the necessity gnawed at her in equal measure. Sometimes alone after last call, she'd tuck Emily in beside her own weary body and wonder, was love enough to protect her child from a world she herself could barely navigate? In so many ways the bar was a portrait of the choices she never wanted to make, but couldn't avoid, not when the world offered so few options for a woman like her, refusing to let go of hope for both herself and her beloved daughter. Emily's fateful day. April dawned with a chill that refused to leave, the kind of morning when the world feels slightly out of balance. In the modest apartment, Emily and Linda had their usual spat, small, ordinary, the sort of mother-daughter quarrel that always faded by lunchtime. Emily, stubborn like her mother, slammed the door and stormed off, determined not to go to school. Linda, exhausted from another night at work, called after her, but the echo of her daughter's steps was drowned by the sounds of the city waking up. Linda initially thought Emily would cool off and be back before noon, maybe with a sheepish smile, asking for her favorite sandwich. But as the sun climbed, worry began to gnaw at her. She checked all the places Emily loved, the playground, the corner store run by Mrs. Patel, and even the steps of the small neighborhood library. Time stretched unbearably thin. Each passing hour weighted Linda's heart with a fear too large for words. By dusk, panic had fully settled in. Linda ran from building to building, shouting Emily's name, clutching the faded photograph she always kept in her wallet. Strangers offered awkward sympathy or brisk indifference, and the police, when they finally arrived, looked tired. A missing kid was another routine report in the jaded city. Linda tried to fight her rising terror with action, stapling flyers to telephone poles, calling relatives she hadn't spoken to in years, replaying the argument in her head for whatever clue she might have missed. The next morning, hope flickered and faded. The apartment, once filled with the easy mess of childhood, felt impossibly silent. The sunbeams shining through a window Emily had once fogged up with doodles hurt Linda's eyes. Sleep was useless. Linda's mind spun with worst-case scenarios, the kind she'd read about in old newspapers or seen on television, except now, she was living it. Hours turned into days. The news became aware of Emily Lawrence's disappearance, but even the headlines brought no comfort, only more reporters and more questions. Every day, Linda returned to the local precinct, growing hoarse with pleading. The world moved on with its usual rhythm, while she hung in a hellish limbo of uncertainty, hope and heartbreak, wrestling within her for control. For every parent, the fear of losing a child is primal and nameless. On that fate-marked day, Emily had simply vanished, swallowed by a city that gave back no answers. And Linda, once just a mother holding on to everyday dreams, now found herself thrust cruelly into the center of a tragedy she'd never imagined facing. A chilling confession. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the unimaginable truth clawed its way into the open. Linda had grown used to the endless dead ends and vague reassurances from the police, each day blending into the next in a fog of desperation. Flyers bearing Emily's bright smile fluttered on lampposts and grocery store windows, rain-soaked and ignored by all but Linda herself. She lived in a loop of panic, grief, and exhausted hope, until the monotony was shattered by a trembling knock on her apartment door. On the threshold stood Jessica Harris, Linda's next-door neighbor. Her appearance was hardly recognizable. Puffy, red-rimmed eyes, hands twisting nervously at the straps of her purse, a voice little more than a whisper. Jessica was known for her discretion, never the type to meddle in the affairs of others. But on that day, she carried a secret too monstrous to keep. She forced herself inside, every step halting, and confessed the nightmare that had unfolded behind closed doors. Through trembling lips and choked sobs, Jessica recounted the events that ripped through Linda's world. Her fiancé, Frank Dalton, the man so many had considered harmless, just another working-class guy with shy mannerisms and unremarkable routines, wasn't who he appeared to be. At first Jessica stumbled, unable to say the words. She'd found small clues, strange stains, irregular absences, and a coldness in Frank she could no longer explain away. One evening, racked by anxiety and suspicion, she'd confronted him. The confession that spilled out was as ice-cold as it was surreal. He had lured Emily into his apartment one afternoon and ended her life with chilling detachment. Jessica collapsed in guilt as she described her horror, struggling with disbelief, wishing desperately that she had acted sooner or seen the signs. Her decision to come forward, spurred by gnawing nightmares and an overwhelming sense of responsibility, was both a desperate plea for her own absolution and an olive branch of truth for Linda. She handed over evidence: Frank's blood-stained shirt, a child's hair clip, a fragment of hope finally freed from the prison of secrecy. For Linda, the room spun. The confession detonated in her mind, shattering even the fragile hope that Emily had simply run away, or might somehow return one day. The grief transformed abruptly from uncertainty to rage at Frank for his monstrous acts, at Jessica for her silence, and at herself for trusting her neighbors, her surroundings, even the thin illusion of safety she thought she'd carved out in the world. Every memory of Emily now glimmered with the unbearable weight of what was lost, and each recollection of Frank, a nod in the hallway, a polite wave across the parking lot, became poison. This moment of revelation traveled fast. Police were called, statements were taken, and suddenly the story that Linda clung to for weeks was brutally revised. The entire apartment building reeled with horror, whispers grew into shouts, suspicion turned to wide-eyed fear. The community, once a tapestry of familiar faces, split apart at the seam of Frank's chilling confession, leaving Linda stranded, staggering under the knowledge that hope and evil could live side by side, only divided by a single, too thin apartment wall. An evil person with a dark past. Frank Dalton's name had once barely registered in the minds of those who lived on Willow Street. If you asked the neighbors about him, most would have only offered the usual shallow small-town observations. Tall, kept to himself, carried a battered lunchbox, mowed his lawn every Saturday. But as secrets came tumbling out, the world saw him in a very different and deeply unsettling light. Frank's early years were marked by an unsettling blend of hardship, isolation, and the seeds of violence. Born the youngest of four to a family constantly on the edge of poverty, he grew up in a weather-beaten home where love was doled out with a miser's hand. His father, a man of few words and plenty of fists, worked irregular construction gigs. His mother vanished for days at a time, leaving the kids to fend for themselves on stale bread, bruised apples, and bargain bin cereal. There were frequent visits from welfare officers and more than a few whispers among neighbors, but none of that prevented the kind of loneliness that curled deep in Frank's bones. At school, he was the quiet one in the back row, the kid whose eyes always flicked toward the exit, never quite trusting, always shrinking from attention. Teachers wrote him off as average. Other children, picking up on the signals of different, oscillated between ignoring him and cruel teasing, sometimes pushing him almost to the point of snapping. Only one teacher, Mrs. Jensen, tried to reach him through kind words and extra help, but even her efforts faded into the gray fog of his daily life. Frank retreated deeper inward, a habit that only sharpened as he got older. By adolescence, the lines between right and wrong blurred for Frank. He was caught more than once shoplifting cheap toys and candy, yet always managed to evoke a sort of pitiful sympathy from local shopkeepers who saw in him a broken boy rather than a budding criminal. The police were called once, maybe twice, but no charges were ever pressed. His age and the family's reputation seemed punishment enough, and Frank slunk back into obscurity. Frank's transition into adulthood did little to smooth his sharp edges. He dropped out of school at 16, taking whatever jobs he could find, cleaning gutters, moving boxes in a warehouse, scrubbing the linoleum at the local grocery store after hours. At each job, he was the invisible one, never earning praise but rarely causing trouble, for a while. But trouble always seemed to find Frank, often through the shadows drawn by his own hand. By his early 20s, Frank landed work at a slaughterhouse on the outskirts of town. The job was brutal, days spent in the cold, with the pungent metallic scent of blood and the ceaseless drone of machinery. His co-workers noticed his indifference to the violence of the job, sometimes even remarking in hushed tones that Frank was too comfortable with suffering. He didn't chat in the locker room, didn't join after-work drinks, never brought up a girlfriend or hobbies. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, often seemed to look straight through people, unsettling even the most hardened old-timers. Sometimes animals would resist him, sensing something off with his touch. Around this period, whispers about Frank's behavior began to circulate. He was spotted in the company of children at the town playground late in the evening, always just out of place. Once a local parent confronted him after noticing Frank lingering near the swings for far too long. Frank brushed it off with awkward, stammered excuses. He was waiting for a friend. He'd lost something in the grass. The parent reported the incident, but the police interview went nowhere. Frank was nervous, but nothing concrete tied him to anything except being weird. Unknown to most, this was not the first time authorities had their eyes on Frank. Sealed juvenile records from another county contained disturbing charges, most of which were missed or minimized after his family moved towns. Officially, he'd been mandated to attend therapy as a teenager, a handful of visits to a poorly funded clinic, a few sessions with overwhelmed counselors, and then nothing. The paperwork simply ended, lost in the churn of an overstretched social system. As Frank drifted through life, red flags continued piling up, but none ever seemed to catch enough official attention. One employer let him go quietly after accusations surfaced about inappropriate comments to a co-worker's child during a company picnic. At another job he was disciplined for sneaking off during breaks and returning with unexplained scratches on his arms. Each time Frank packed up and vanished, moving to the next town, the next job, slipping away before consequences could catch up. Frank learned early to play the system to his advantage. When he found himself facing potential charges, for trespassing at a local elementary school, or for being found in the company of minors without a clear reason, he leaned heavily on the narrative of mental illness. He produced doctor's notes from physicians he'd only seen a handful of times with phrases such as emotional disturbance, dissociative episodes, or chronic anxiety. These diagnoses became both a defense and a shield, deflecting suspicion or leading to court-ordered chemical therapy instead of jail time. Frank became an expert at saying just enough to keep the law at bay, while never truly engaging with treatment beyond what was required. By his 30s, Frank lived on the fringes, skipping states, holding odd jobs, drifting from one sagging apartment to another. His criminal history, sealed records, dismissed charges, and medical waivers became nearly impossible for any potential employer or landlord to fully untangle. He was a ghost in the system, slipping through cracks that had widened just enough to keep him out of true accountability. When he moved to Willow Street, hardly anyone looked into his background. The town, eager for tenants, asked little and required less. Linda first noticed Frank as an unremarkable presence, the sort of neighbor whose routine was so rigid it almost felt staged. He'd nod, mumble greetings, and keep an odd distance, never smiling or making small talk. To most adults he was simply awkward, certainly not a figure to be trusted with secrets, but not obviously a threat. It was only later, when Linda retraced every memory after Emily's disappearance, that she realized how much she'd missed. The way Frank's eyes lingered when children played, his flat expression when Emily said hello, the odd times he seemed to appear behind her in the parking lot, silent as a shadow. Frank's past, it turned out, was a tapestry of institutional failures. Social workers had flagged him, judges had ordered evaluations, clinics had signed off on releases, but no single piece of evidence was ever damning enough, and time after time Frank evaded meaningful consequence. When national news reported his history after Emily's case broke, the outcry was immediate and furious. How could a man with so many warning signs, so many close calls, still be free to walk the streets? Perhaps most galling was the realization that Frank himself seemed numb to repercussions. During his police interrogations, he answered questions with chilling detachment, offering only the barest admissions of guilt. If he showed remorse, it was as a rehearsed twitch, not a stirring of conscience. His psychological profiles, eventually released to lawyers and select reporters, painted a portrait of a man disconnected from typical human empathy, able to mimic normality just well enough to survive. In every way that counted, Frank was a case study in how a community, a system, and perhaps a nation could fail to protect its own children. The collapse of Linda's collapse was not a single moment, but a slow, relentless unraveling, a process that began the instant she realized Emily was never coming home. At first it was the numbness, a thick, blanket-like detachment that muffled sound and light and pain. She found herself wading through days as though underwater, every sensation at a dull remove. Friends would speak to her and she would nod along, barely registering their words. The world outside seemed faded, as if someone had drained the color from her existence. She stopped answering the phone unless it was a call from the police, and even then, hope flickered out faster each time she picked up. Food lost its taste, and most nights she simply stared at the beige wall across from her bed until morning came, her body present but her mind drifting through old memories like a ghost. The grief wasn't loud, not at first. It was oppressive and silent, the type of despair that clings to your bones and feels almost peaceful in its permanence. As the initial shock wore off, Linda's grief began to mutate, taking on sharp edges. Everywhere she looked, life carried on with cruel indifference. Mothers herding children through grocery aisles, young girls laughing together on buses, the distant sound of a playground at recess. She hated that the world could be so blind to her pain. The loneliness gnawed at her. It felt like everyone around her pitied her for all the wrong reasons, and even the most well-intentioned gestures, home-cooked meals from neighbors, envelopes left in her mailbox with cash or cards, seemed to emphasize her isolation. More insidious, however, was the way guilt crept in. It haunted Linda in the hours before dawn, the enduring question of where she had gone wrong, what she might have missed or changed. She replayed every argument she'd had with Emily, every time she'd raised her voice or hurried her out the door to make it to work on time. She scrutinized the last morning, magnifying every trivial detail. If only she had noticed something unusual. If only she hadn't been so distracted by her double shift. If only she had been less trusting of her surroundings. Eventually self-blame grew into a twisted companion, convincing Linda she bore just as much responsibility for Emily's fate as Frank Dalton himself. She filled journals with frantic looping handwriting, writing letters to Emily and to herself, searching for forgiveness but never quite able to find it. Even the support groups the police recommended felt hollow, safe spaces where trauma circled endlessly, but none seemed to match the unique, sharp pain of a mother who'd lost her only child to violence. Linda's apartment, once cluttered and lively, became a mausoleum. Emily's bedroom remained untouched, the pink bedding carefully smoothed, unicorn stickers still clinging to the dresser, books stacked on the nightstand exactly as they'd been left. Sometimes, Linda would sit in the doorway for hours, knees hugged to her chest, staring at the empty bed and listening for echoes that never came. On bad nights, she wandered the city in her old coat, tracing the routes she'd once walked holding Emily's hand, desperately searching for something she couldn't name. The well-meaning but awkward visits from family dwindled. Her own mother, never close, simply didn't know what to say. Old friends found excuses, a job interview, a sick child, an early meeting. Linda understood why. Her pain made her difficult to be around, and she was powerless to change it. Even at work, where she forced herself back behind the bar out of necessity, customers averted their eyes and colleagues spoke to her with forced, brittle cheer. She was more ghost than woman, haunting the margins of her own life. The final, irrevocable fracture began when Linda decided she could not wait for justice any longer. As Frank Dalton was indicted and details emerged in the press, Linda's anger at the legal system mounted. Each new headline seemed to diminish Emily, a tragic case reduced to court schedules and legal wrangling. Linda attended every pretrial session, sitting in the back row, swallowing her rage at each postponement, loophole, and plea bargain discussed. She watched attorneys debate evidence, heard experts testify about Frank's mental state, and saw time and again how the courtroom felt designed to protect the accused instead of centering the victim. In private, Linda's thoughts grew darker and more focused. She abandoned the notion of healing. Instead, she dreamed of retribution, scenarios where she could confront Frank, where he would be forced to feel even a fraction of the pain he caused. Sometimes her fantasies frightened her. They were violent, visceral, and foreign to the gentler woman she once was. But the world no longer made sense, its rules seemed flimsy and unjust, and every news segment about other children lost to violence deepened her sense that the system was broken beyond repair. Sleep became impossible. On the rare occasions Linda closed her eyes, her dreams were fevered and fragmented. Emily's voice calling for help, courtroom benches warped into prison bars, blood-red alarm clocks ticking away the seconds of her powerless rage. She no longer trusted herself to discern the boundary between justice and vengeance, only that both seemed unreachable. She saw therapists, at her lawyer's urging, but the sessions felt like emotional charades. They wanted her to voice her feelings, to trace her anger, to map her grief. Linda found herself lying, saying the right words, nodding at platitudes about time and healing, while inside the torrent only intensified. She wrote more letters to Emily, stashing them beneath her mattress, always ending with apologies for failing to keep her safe. The day of the trial approached like an eclipse, drawing all light and hope from Linda's horizon. She stopped pretending in public, letting her own sadness and fury show. She wore the same black dress every day, shunning makeup, and cut her hair short, unable to stand the sight of herself unchanged, while everything else had been destroyed. Occasionally she would find herself whispering to Emily, sometimes in the grocery store, sometimes in the hush of dawn, asking for a sign, or for forgiveness. There was never an answer, only the steady march toward the courthouse. When the trial commenced, Linda's presence in the courtroom became both a rallying point and an awkward reminder to everyone present. Journalists snuck glances at her, and other parents, those who had lost children or come close, found ways to let their hands brush against hers in mute solidarity. Yet even amidst the crowd, Linda's isolation was absolute. She had become so consumed by grief and fury that every word spoken by the defense, every protestation of Frank's supposed suffering, seemed to erode what little remained of her patience with the world. It was in this crucible, of public spectacle, private torment, and institutional failure, that Linda's last, desperate resolve was forged. By now, the idea of letting due process run its course felt like another cruelty, not a hope. She watched as Frank took the stand with a blank expression, listened as lawyers bickered over technicalities, and felt the floor of her universe simply give way. She was not a woman contemplating crime, she told herself. She was a mother, denied any other choice, balancing on the knife's edge between despair and defiance. The trial and shocking actions. The day of the trial felt less like a search for justice, and more like the finale of a brutal public spectacle. Linda Lawrence arrived at the courthouse before dawn, the crisp March wind biting through her thrift store coat. The grand stone steps, normally only graced by lawyers and clerks, were already swarming with cameras and news vans. Reporters jockeyed for position, their breath fogging in the cold as they speculated about what would unfold inside. To the world outside, this was a landmark case, a test of just how far the chasm between law and morality could stretch. For Linda, however, it was simply an ending she had never wanted to face. Her face was gaunt, eyes ringed with fatigue and grief, and she clutched the same battered photo of Emily she'd carried since the first search party set out months before. Inside, courtroom security was tight, the tension so thick it made the simple act of breathing difficult. Frank Dalton sat between two officers, expression impassive, his suit a size too big, the uniform of the accused tailored by poverty. He didn't so much as glance at Linda. His court-appointed lawyer shuffled papers without looking up. The air was plagued by the low buzz of whispered legalese. Opening statements were measured, almost sterile, each side speaking to a version of events that Linda could no longer recognize as reality. It was as if the courtroom languages of guilt, innocence, burden of proof, and defendants' rights had tamed the savage enormity of Linda's loss into a distant intellectual debate. Prosecutors methodically recounted the evidence, displaying photos one by one. Linda flinched when Emily's image flashed on the screen, the last school photo, her daughter's smile so familiar yet now impossible to touch. Witnesses retold memories and moments, Jessica trembling as she repeated her confession, neighbors called to provide their recollections of that fateful afternoon. For Linda, each retelling of Emily's disappearance felt like salt in a wound that would not close. The defense leaned heavily on Frank's mental health history, painting a portrait of a troubled, misunderstood man failed by the very system meant to protect both him and those around him. Psychiatric experts described dissociative episodes, chemical therapy, diagnoses blurred by jargon, and the failure to follow through on recommendations for institutionalization. None of that mattered to Linda. Each delay, every legal argument or clinical explanation became another brick in the wall of her mounting frustration. The machinery of due process ground on for days, then weeks, stretching the agony further by technicalities and recesses. Sometimes Linda would close her eyes and try to block out the drone of testimony, letting her thoughts spiral through memories of Emily's laughter, her hand warm in Linda's. Each instance the prosecution alluded to trauma or loss. Linda could feel the collective gaze of the jury and the press flick toward her, some with pity, some with suspicion, some perhaps simply eager for drama. By the time Frank Dalton was scheduled to testify, the mood in the courtroom was brittle, an undercurrent of unrest pressing just beneath the surface. Linda had watched the accused sit in silence for weeks, never meeting her gaze, never showing even the flicker of emotion. When he finally took the stand, recounting events with mechanical detachment, she clenched her fists so tightly, the photograph's edges cut into her palms. His words were monotone, his answers short, calculated, and seemingly rehearsed. The moment he denied remembering details of the day Emily vanished, Linda's vision blurred. A desperate, throbbing fury rushed in to fill the space where hope had once lived. Journalists, smelling a moment, leaned forward with anticipation. The judge, voice weary, asked for order again and again. The evidence was damning, but the gears of justice turned slowly, sometimes too slowly for a world ravaged by grief and outrage. It felt to Linda like the entire process had devolved into a performance, attorneys bickering over predicate evidence, the defense cataloging Frank's suffering, and Linda, always just an arm's length from agency, turning invisible from the sheer weight of her pain. That morning, as court reconvened, Linda's inner narrative played on a loop, replaying the last time she'd kissed Emily's forehead, the endless days spent waiting for justice to arrive, the growing, gnawing sense that the law would never deliver. Her breath came shallow in her chest, her fingers curled around the cold metal pressed into her purse, the weight heavy but strangely familiar. She told herself this was just a contingency, a silent protest in steel. But rage and heartbreak are not known for their restraint. It happened quickly, too quickly for anyone to react. Frank Dalton had just finished a guarded, hollow answer to a cross-examination question, the same denial, the same blank stare. Linda rose to her feet. The scrape of her chair startled those nearby. Heads turned, a ripple moving through the courtroom as if some primal alarm had been triggered. Time experienced a strange elasticity in that moment, everything at once frantic and eerily slow. Linda stepped out from the gallery, her footsteps echoing in the marble and linoleum stillness. No one quite realized what was happening until it was too late to stop. Her hand slipped into her purse, the revolver passed through her trembling fingers as if in a dream. Without speaking, without warning, Linda raised the weapon and fired. For a split second, there was disbelief. Then chaos erupted. Shouts and screams ricocheted off the walls as bodies dove for cover. The gun's report, a dull, deafening thunder, reverberated through the chambers. Security rushed the aisle, pushing through confused, terrified onlookers. Frank Dalton crumpled, wounded and bleeding onto the oak floor, his face registering shock for the first and only time. It all transpired in less than 10 seconds, but for Linda, and everyone who witnessed it, the moment stretched out forever, burning itself into memory. Linda let the gun fall from her hand. The world, which had not made sense since the day Emily disappeared, was suddenly, briefly silent. Reporters regained their composure first, their camera flashes strobing the stunned faces of judge and jury alike. Some in the gallery wept openly, others stared, mouths agape at the crossroads of vengeance and law. Linda murmured, "For my Emily," before allowing herself to be taken quietly into custody, wrists bound, shoulders slumped, not in defeat but in completion. Shockwaves from Linda's actions reverberated far outside the tight confines of the courtroom. That afternoon, national news stations interrupted broadcasts to relay the breaking story. The footage, grainy, frantic, potent with the raw immediacy of tragedy, played in endless loops. The mother's desperate resolve, the courtroom disarray, and the image of Frank's blood on the pristine floor. Commentators argued over what had happened. Was it a failure of the law, or a mother's heartbreak overtaking all boundaries? Overnight, Linda was recast in the public imagination as both an avenger and a cautionary tale. Social media lit up with hashtags. Op-eds debated whether justice could or should ever require such desperate acts. Within the legal system itself, Linda's outburst forced a reckoning. Courthouse security reviews were launched, new procedures rushed into place, and the trial's interruption became a subject in law schools and on talk shows. More than that, it reignited old debates about the meaning of justice, about what it truly costs, who gets to seek it, and where the line exists between vengeance and a system meant to protect. For the people present in that room, lives would never quite return to normal. Some jurors needed counseling. The judge, rattled and humbled, took extended leave. Reporters who witnessed the shooting wrote books, launched podcasts, each seeking to unravel the tangled strands of law, loss, and love that exploded in those few seconds. Linda, awaiting sentencing in a holding cell, held tight to the last photograph of her daughter. The moment had carried its own terrible resolution, yet there were only new questions in its wake, questions the law, for all its rituals and rules, still struggled to answer. And in the end, the world was left to ponder not just what Linda had done, but why a system could drive a quiet, devoted mother to such a desperate public act. Public opinion erupts, compassion or law. In the aftermath of the courtroom shooting, national attention surged in a way that felt almost dizzying. Within hours, news stations looped shaky cell phone footage and artists' courtroom sketches, while social media erupted in a wildfire of hashtags and emotional tributes. Linda Lawrence's name was suddenly everywhere, her grief and her gunshot echoing far outside New Jersey, sparking a heated, relentless debate that would captivate America for weeks on end. Talk radio and television pundits dissected the case on every channel. On one side, voices argued for compassion. They painted Linda not as a criminal, but as a broken mother backed into a corner by a system that seemed slow, impersonal, and ultimately powerless. Callers wept on air as they compared her to figures from Greek tragedy, ordinary women transformed by injustice into reluctant avengers. Well-known opinion writers condemned the failure of the child welfare and legal systems. They highlighted all the warning signs missed in Frank Dalton's past, dissecting every bureaucratic fumble that placed him in proximity to someone as vulnerable as Emily. In park benches, cafes, workplaces, and schools across the country, people argued about Linda's actions, sometimes in hushed tones over morning coffee, sometimes with raised voices at dinner tables divided along generational or ideological lines. Some Americans, especially parents, confessed they could not condemn what Linda had done. They claimed her act was not premeditated murder, but a desperate human outburst, a mother's heartburn transformed into a tragic instant of judgment. To them, the law's clinical approach to justice had only made Linda's grief more unbearable, and her violence, though regrettable, seemed to grow from seeds of compassion, not evil. Others, however, saw Linda's act as a frightening breach of order, a crack in the social contract that held society together. Legal experts and officials worried aloud about the precedent it set. Editorials warned, if one mother's grief could override the courts, what would stop others from taking justice into their own hands? They emphasized the importance of due process, reminding readers and viewers that even the most sympathetic motives could not justify the collapse of law and order. One prosecutor, interviewed on national television, described the shooting as a collective tragedy, not just for Emily and Linda, but for everyone who relied on the idea of fair trials and a system above personal vengeance. The media, for their part, treated the story as both spectacle and cautionary tale. Some morning hosts invited psychologists to explain the psychological toll of losing a child, reinforcing Linda's image as a woman destroyed by sorrow. Primetime anchors featured legal analysts who debated back and forth, could Linda claim temporary insanity? Should the judge show mercy? Or would that only encourage vigilantism? Local newspapers ran front-page photos of mothers at rallies, holding signs reading, "Justice for Linda," or "Law and Order for All." Almost overnight, the case infected politics. Politicians and activists seized the story as a symbol for their own causes. Advocacy groups for crime victims called for reforms, tougher background checks on offenders, more funding for mental health interventions, better support for families at risk. Some conservative voices insisted that Linda's actions underscored the need for harsher punishments and less leniency, so that mothers would never feel forced to take justice into their own hands. Progressive commentators, meanwhile, criticized the lack of social safety nets, arguing it was the absence of support, not an excess, that drove Linda to the edge. Social media, as always, amplified the clash. Digital artists posted haunting portraits of Linda and Emily, while hashtags like #Heartbreak and Justice, #Linda Lawrence, and #Reform or Revolt trended for days. Online petitions demanded Linda's release, others called for stricter security at courthouses. In comment sections and message boards, strangers traded stories of their own close calls with injustice, some swearing they'd have done the same as Linda, others fearing that empathy was being weaponized as an excuse for chaos. The debate spread beyond American borders, picked up by international media who offered their own analyses and cultural takes. Psychologists, clergy, and ethicists weighed in, discussing at length, what is justice truly? What happens when the law becomes so abstract or delayed that people cannot bear to wait? Could compassion and order coexist? Or were they, in moments like these, fundamentally opposed? Communities most affected by violence and grief, the ones who saw themselves reflected in Linda's desperate act, found themselves at the center of renewed conversations. Candlelight vigils sprang up in several states. At one, a speaker recited Emily's favorite poem. At another, a group of mothers clasped hands and observed a minute of silence for every parent who has ever felt powerless. The controversy forced legal scholars and lawmakers to address uncomfortable realities. Round tables were convened on news specials and at city halls to discuss the balance between the heart and the law. Some judges, in interviews, privately admitted empathy for Linda, confiding that, but for the rules of their profession, they might have felt the same impulse under similar circumstances. Others steeled themselves for a rise in similar crimes of passion if Linda received too light a sentence. In the end, what burned most fiercely was the sense that the system had failed everyone, Emily, Linda, even the communities meant to be sheltered by justice's impartiality. Americans echoed a question older than the nation itself. When the law is not enough, what is left to hold us together? The storm of opinions quieted only gradually, leaving behind a new fracture in the national dialogue, one lined with grief, moral ambiguity, and a stubborn, undimmed hope that one day compassion and justice might finally walk side by side. Consequences and unanswered questions. In the months that followed the fateful shooting, the world around Linda Lawrence seemed to change and yet, in many ways, remained stubbornly immovable. The trial's dramatic apex had faded from sensationalist headlines replaced by newer tragedies and scandals, but the questions it provoked continued to echo through the halls of courtrooms, homes, and the collective American psyche. Linda herself quickly became a symbol, alternately pitied, feared, and quietly revered. Yet for those closest to the events, the aftermath was messy and uncertain. The promised clarity of justice left elusive and incomplete. For Linda, the legal journey did not end with her arrest. Psychiatrists and lawyers, judges and advocates all circled her life like distant satellites, analyzing her every emotion and memory. In the sterile confines of her cell, she was subjected to evaluations and questioned relentlessly. What had she felt the moment she pulled the trigger? Had she planned her actions? Did she regret them? The answers, when they came, were always tangled, a tapestry of love, pain, and the primal human urge to claim back control from chaos. Linda's sentencing provoked its own wave of controversy. She was convicted not of premeditated murder, but of voluntary manslaughter, a concession to the trauma and psychological devastation that experts attested had consumed her since Emily's death. Some in America howled for a harsher penalty, insisting that grief should not mitigate punishment for taking a life. Others, meanwhile, saw only a mother broken by a flawed system, deserving not just leniency, but compassion and systemic change. The debates raged in op-eds and legislative halls, but quietly, even after the gavel fell, the matter was far from settled. What truly lingered was a sense of unresolved moral reckoning. The brutality of Linda's grief and the extremity of her actions cracked open fissures in the narrative of American justice. Could you blame a mother for doing what the courts could not? Was Linda's act a symptom of an irreparably broken system or simply the tragic outcome of a singular story? For months, experts in law, psychology, philosophy, and faith jockeyed to provide answers, but consensus was impossible. When surveyed, Americans split almost evenly, some seeing Linda's crime as an unforgivable affront to order, others as a necessary waking call for empathy and reform. Beyond the debate, tangible reforms flickered on the horizon, but their reach and permanence remained uncertain. Lawmakers in several states introduced new measures to close holes in background check systems, require better tracking and treatment for sex offenders and violent criminals, and provide more robust mental health resources for survivors of trauma. Some bills passed, others stalled, and in all cases there was unease. For each administrative fix, there were always unforeseen consequences and lingering doubts. No legislative act could restore what was lost, nor erase the grief that had driven Linda, and thousands of parents like her, to the edge of despair. Meanwhile, Linda's own community was left scarred, but also suffused with a strange sense of solidarity. Support groups for grieving and traumatized parents swelled in membership, their meetings layered now with cautionary tales and the flickering hope of healing. Vigils for Emily continued long after the media departed, small acts of remembrance that tried to recapture the innocence that violence had shattered. Yet there were also rifts and tensions, those who felt justice had been denied, those angered by the martyrdom of a killer, and those warning that lines between right and wrong were being erased by sentimentality. For Linda, the prison sentence was paradoxically both punishment and reprieve. The routine, the predictability of institutional life, provided a numb kind of order compared to the chaos that had defined her world since Emily's disappearance. She became an unlikely touchstone for other inmates, especially those with stories of loss and impossible choices. Letters poured in, from strangers, mothers, even jurors, some offering forgiveness, others condemnation, a few simply searching for understanding in a world rendered ambiguous by tragedy. Within her sparse cell, Linda kept a small archive. At the center always, a fading photograph of Emily, a reminder of love, and of everything justice could neither repair nor reclaim. She read the news clippings, the think pieces, the impassioned letters from citizens wrestling with her case, and wondered whether the world would ever move on, or if beneath its surface the pain was universal and unending. She wrote her own letters too, addressed to no one in particular, apologies, explanations, and restless queries about fate, forgiveness, and whether justice could ever truly balance love and law. Some nights the silence carried the weight of all that had gone unsaid. Other parents, those who had lost children or almost lost them, found in Linda's actions a reflection of their own worst nightmares and unvoiced desires. For every message condemning her, another arrived in gratitude, as if Linda's final act of desperation had given voice to multitudes still silenced by their pain. In both directions, the correspondence pointed to a nation caught in perpetual tension between mercy and order, forever negotiating the cost of collective security and individual heartbreak. The legal sphere, too, continued to reckon with Linda's legacy. Law schools hosted moot courts and symposia dissecting her case, using it as a cautionary study in the limitations of adversarial justice systems. Did due process serve the victim, the accused, or the larger community? And what should happen when those interests diverged? Policy wonks and politicians debated how to prevent such tragedies in the future, but behind every proposal was the uneasy admission that no amount of bureaucracy could erase human fallibility or the depths of grief. The ghost of Linda's act haunted their decisions, even as the details were slowly stripped of their emotional charge and reduced to legal precedent. For Linda's extended family and for the larger American public, the legacy of her actions was equally complicated. Friends struggled to reconcile the woman they once knew with the one on trial. Some cut ties, unable or unwilling to process the enormity of it all. Others rallied, steadfast in the conviction that hers was a struggle against a world gone callous, not a simple crime. The wounds opened by the case radiated outward, inward too, challenging comfortable narratives about guilt, innocence, and the line dividing the broken-hearted from the irredeemable. Emily's case, alongside Linda's defiant violence, remained a touchstone in public consciousness not simply for what was lost, but for what it exposed. American society, proud of its traditions of due process and equal protection, found itself split, uncertain whether to fear Linda or exalt her, whether to grieve the girl or interrogate the mother. Candlelight vigils bore more than Emily's name. They invoked every lost child, every time the system stalled or stumbled. Victims' rights groups, faith leaders, school administrators, and activists each claimed the case as their own, weaving it into calls for everything from restorative justice reforms to stricter sentencing policies. Yet for all its noise, the aftermath brought few answers and many lingering wounds. The law, so often invoked as the final word, seemed mutable, bent in the face of suffering, hardened by the threat of chaos. Children continued to fall through cracks, parents braced themselves against their own helplessness, and judges walked into courtrooms shadowed by the knowledge that they might face another Linda Lawrence one day. In that sense, the shooting and its reverberations became more than a case. It was a shadow thrown over every subsequent trial, a whispered warning that beneath society's neat surfaces lurk rage, despair, and the kind of love that breaks all rules. Linda's story eventually faded from news cycles, but not from the memories of those it touched. There were no neat resolutions, no last-minute redemption, no comfort in the law's pronouncements or in the public's endless cycling between outrage and empathy. For Linda, for Emily, and for the millions drawn to their story, what remained were questions neither courts nor commentaries could answer. How do we measure justice when loss is so irrevocable? What price should love pay? And is it ever right to put law below the heart? Do the wounds opened by violence and failure ever truly heal, or are they simply accepted, pressed into the fabric of the nation's conscience? With time, the focus of the story shifted gradually away from concrete events to the shadows they cast. Linda, in rare interviews, refused either guilt or vindication. She spoke of longing, brokenness, and the stubborn ache for absolution she knew was impossible. Scholars and writers mined her testimony, her letters, each public statement, searching for insight into the boundaries of love, the limits of reason, and the price society will or will not pay to protect its most vulnerable. For every policy changed and every law tightened, there seemed to arise a matching unease, a discomfort with the knowledge that some tragedies cannot be reasoned or legislated away. Newspapers moved on, yet in book clubs, on talk shows, and in the quiet exchanges between parents lying awake past midnight, the questions continued to surface, raw and restless. Linda's actions, the grief that preceded them, and the system that failed her would become, for many, less of a lesson and more of a warning, that beneath any community, no matter how safe or ordered, lie the seeds of chaos sown by love and loss. Years later, a memorial bench appeared in a city park, a small plaque engraved not with a name but with the words, "For every child whose story remains unfinished." The plaque gathered petals, notes, even the occasional crumpled news clipping, a silent, ongoing answer to the tale of Linda and Emily, that some losses never resolve and some questions must be carried, not solved. The shadow of Linda's choice endures, a ghost walking beside American justice, never fully explained, never fully forgiven, and never truly consigned to the past.